So I'm looking for Graham to nod at me here because he's still on mute. But was corruption around an original Fantasy Role Play, or was that a more recent?
No.
Oh, it's there.
Yay!
I heard you.
We heard you.
Oh.
Heard you. Yeah.
Hey.
You're back in the room.
I don't know what's changed then, because hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Right, start recording again.
No. Hi, this is Steve, aka @AllOnThar on Twitter, and here are some more of my gaming vexes. Hello, and welcome to another episode of my Gaming Vexes. It's my mission to play or run all of the games I've purchased, in hard copy mind, not PDF, I'm not completely unhinged, and then reflect on the experiences with my friends. This one is a spin-off from episode 26, where we talked about the Red Markets RPG. Graham Kinniber, a firm devotee of grim games, wondered what makes a game grim and what is it that draws players and GMs to it. So here we are, having a lovely chat about grimness in games. Ironically, although Graham came up with the idea for the episode, as you may have realised from the intro, technical issues meant that all he could do for much of the discussion was gurn at our ill-considered opinions over video link, as we couldn't hear him until much later in the recording. However, Graham did send over some additional commentary that you can hear at the end of the main discussion. Thanks to Fabio, Graham, Kat and the Neils, Benson and Hopkins for their contributions on this one. I hope you enjoy it. If you do like what you hear, perhaps you consider leaving us a positive review, either on iTunes or your platform of choice. If you do leave one somewhere other than iTunes though, please let me know, otherwise I might never come across it. In common with other podcasters, we thrive on feedback, and hearing that someone likes what we do keeps us going through editing purgatory. With that in mind, we've had another review, this time from Jim, @JimJimTheGrim, on Twitter.
Hi Steve. When I listen to the podcast, I imagine the Sunday night after a weekend of gaming. Everyone's chatting in the pub, having a laugh and a stab at analysing the game. The anecdotes come out in between a few observations and the odd serious point. Thanks to you and the contributors for taking me to that happy place. Please keep up the good work, and I'll continue to raise a glass when I listen. Cheers, Jim.
Thanks for the kind words, Jim. They're very much appreciated. And with that, get ready. So thanks everyone. Today we're talking about grim gaming, really. So this was something that came up really as a consequence of us talking about Red Markets, which I think you could probably argue is definitely a grim game. And so first of all, let's have some introductions.
Fabio Volono, and that's my Twitter handle. Last grim game, it's the granddaddy of all of it, which is Call of Cthulhu. I ran that on Saturday, and it was a pretty lethal one, and I had two players. I didn't kill two players, but
the dice did.
Okay, so I'm Neil, a.k.a. Old Scouser RPing on Twitter. I'm also on this Mastodon thing as well, but I can't quite remember what I'm called on there. Anyway, the last grimdark thing I played, I played Call of Cthulhu just last week. So I'm going to go with that as well. I don't know. Call of Cthulhu is more horror than grimdark, but
we might talk about the difference actually between.
But anyway, there you go. That's the best you're going to get for now.
So Neil, aka Thermal Satsuma on Twitter, and Satsuma at Dice Camp on Mastodon. I think that's me on there. Last grimdark game I played, Vassen on Saturday. That was vengeful spirits and dead children, and also the humans were probably more selfish and cruel than the monsters. So much fun was had by all.
That's the heart of any horror thing, is that the monsters pale significance. It's how horrible people are to each other. It's truly horrifying.
I'm Kat. I'm at Mere for Beer on Twitter. I'm also the editor of Nevermind Dice Roll Zine, so I'm often found on that on Mastodon, but I can't remember the handle. A bit like Neil, a bit new, I can't really remember it. The last grimdark game I played was Spire, where you play a drow who are fighting against the elves who have taken over your city. you're never going to win. You're never going to get rid of them. It's just how far your morals are going to be compromised as you try to survive, or in our case, not survive and die horribly.
That's interesting, because in that it's not so much physical threat, it's more about, as you say, moral degeneration, isn't it, really?
Yeah, it is.
Yeah, that's interesting. So I suppose the idea is, first of all, is thinking about, well, I mean, we all touched on some of the points about what might make a game grim. So we talked about Call of Cthulhu. Obviously, that's, people losing their sanity. We've talked about how horrible people are to each other, people or drow or other sentient beings. From our perspective, what makes a game grim? Is it background? Is it rules? What is it?
I think it's a combination, because you can definitely have games that have got a grim background, but the characters are fairly high status, or they wade through the mire with their shining armor and righting wrongs. That's definitely not grim. But if you're one of the peasants splashing about in the mud and everything's hopeless and you're probably going to die a miserable death, and that's a grim game. The classic Dungeons and Dragons, isn't it? That you're sort of going in and massacring goblins in a dungeon they're sort of eating bones and dressed in filthy rags.
Yeah.
You're merrily going and stealing the treasure and coming out to be heroes. But if you were one of the goblins, then it would be a very different experience.
So we're talking about the latest iteration of the galaxy's favourite role-playing game, clearly. So, because 5e really is that, isn't it? Because actually player characters have a lovely time most of the time, don't they, in that? So
is that an example of not grim?
Yes, anti-grim.
Yeah. Anti-grim. Yeah. Okay. That's okay. Yeah.
I'm just wondering about the editions on D&D, because I do feel like the first edition was so much grimmer than the 5th edition, where there's the capability or you're more likely to die as a player character. But going back to the classic Keep on the Borderlands, there's that dilemma that happens this is a spoiler if you haven't played Keep on the Borderlands. There's the section where you're going through the kobold lair and you're hacking away through kobolds. That's all, that's okay, that's all right to a certain degree. But you get to that last chamber practically, and there's that dilemma. And it happened, I remember a couple of times where players are just going, oh my God, we've got kobold women or mothers and their children. And there's that dilemma as a player. Do you kill the kobold children as well, which is really grim in my eyes?
I mean, I think there is a point about addition. So,
also there's with D&D, it's the worlds as well. I agree with Neil, both the rule setting and the world setting. You need both of them to get it to kind of mesh as a proper system. But that's the same for any game. But D&D had certain worlds. Dark Sun, that is a very grim dark setting. And that's a D&D setting. You're stuck on a dying world where magic really rips nature apart. So you've got cannibal halflings running around. You've got druids who do not trust anybody. If you found casting magic, you're dead. It's a really nasty setting. Whereas a lot of the Forgotten Realms,
light
and fluffy in comparison.
But I think you're right. I think it seems to be having the rules and the background in conjunction does help. So, I mean, for me, something, I suppose what Fabio was saying about old school essentials essentially is BX. I mean, that would seem to be a grim game. I mean, Neil is the, you're the one who tends to run that more than anyone else. So
I think it can vary. I think like when you're talking about D&D, I mean, in my opinion, it's far more about the setting and the tone of the game and the encounters you have and so on than the actual rules. So OSE could very easily be very, very grim. And I think for me, the one that really stands out, if you recall, Steve, when we played Better Than Any Man with Lamentations of the Flame Princess, which is a variation of Bethany, really. But it's a similar rule set. But the whole setting, I mean, it's a historical setting, in the 30 Years' War, but everything about it is so twisted and grim and desperate. And I don't even think grim or grim dark is particularly about how likely your characters are to die. I don't really think that's part of it. I think it's much more about how the world impacts them and what they see and encounter as they go along. And then some systems will put that into the rules. So, certain things will have effects on your characters as you go into the game. I know you've got mechanics in your list, and perhaps we'll touch on that. But I think just at this stage, I don't think it's about how lethal the game is or anything like that. I think it's much more about tone and the things that you're going to encounter. And perhaps a bit of shock kind of as well, is this something shocking and you might see as...
So if we think about, because tone for me is connected with background and sort of story and that sort of thing. And as you say, it can be reflected in rules, and we'll come to that. But in terms of tone, are we saying that it needs, and again, we're not just talking about fantasy, this could be any genre really. Are we talking about something where death is commonplace? And again, just leave the rules to one side, but death is commonplace. Actually, magic it's a relatively low magic environment, and the things that you do. So if your character encounters some, unpleasant violence, it's going to be quite difficult for them to get over it. What is it about? What do you need to see in a background or a setting for it to be grim?
Well, it's not heroic, is it? I mean, you talked about death as commonplace, and I think it's not just death for the characters, but like death is all around them. People are suffering. The world's gone to crap, and death might be not far away. And I certainly think that's a big part of it. Because
in Red Market, a lot of it is about societal collapse. Really, is that it's what's the end result of in that instance capitalism sort of keeping going, even though everything else has fallen apart. And it's got some pretty, and obviously there's zombies in as well, which has a sort of a horrifying aspect to it.
I think personally, you talk about the setting and the rules, but how about the actual format of the rules or the book? And I think one of the grimmest and darkest of those, and it really comes across just opening that book, is Mork Borg. That world is just, you are playing really scummy. The whole world's gone, as Neil said, it's collapsed. It's that is a real grim, and I think they've based it on
Swedish death metal,
Swedish death metal, Swedish dark metal, which is, I think, Candlemass is that. But that's the whole thing. That even just the format, even though it's bright fluorescent yellow and it's got that punky kind of font going on, but the whole format of every page of just skulls and death and everything else really is the grimmest, I think.
There's an air of humour with Mork Borg as well, because I think when we played it was certainly a grim setting, but we were finding the humour in the most horrible, ridiculous things. So I think there were probably more laughs in that game where we were talking about cannibalism and flaming skulls and all the rest of it, and we've discussed this on a previous podcast. So maybe there's an element of tone in the game. It can be a grim setting, but you're approaching it in a sort of fairly light-hearted way, and you're going to die, but you just click the button and scumify a new character straight away. So that's not the same risk as that you're going to die and then that's it.
When we talk about grim games, Warhammer is one fancy role play is definitely one that's in there, and that's got humour in, but I think it's more, I don't know, and again, it depends how you play it, but I think the humour seems to be more to the fore, certainly in what my experience of Mork Borg. And okay, people can read it differently. Whereas I think in Warhammer, it's more relief, because if you didn't have that a bit of humour in there, especially in the older editions, people had silly names that sort of, whereas it's not so present now. So I think it seems to be more of a humorous game, whereas now I think it seems to be going down that quite desperate route, maybe.
I think for me, what makes grimdark is the fact that death is not the worst thing, because it's final. You die. There's no resurrection in a lot of grimdark games. I can't think of any really where there is such a thing as, you could give your cleric a diamond and up your pop. There isn't that. But what you do have is you can be injured, you can be, severely take penalties for having a dodgy leg, or mentally your character can break down. In Spire, you do have fallout and etc., usually on the mental or social stats. And some of the other games like Symbaroum, which I'd definitely say would be a grimdark setting, you have corruption. And have very powerful magic in Symbaroum. But the more you use it, and if you're too careless, you get corrupted. You turn into that monster in the woods. And your fellow players have to watch you turning into that, which adds to it at the table, because they're kind of going there, yeah, it's always been great to be alongside Cat in the Woods. She's always been there, to the point of, we might have to put her down at some stage if this continues. And that makes it a very grim setting, because no longer it's this, we're all in it together type thing. You've got to watch your fellow players. I mean, in Red Markets, that was a campaign, because we did it as a convention game with you. But if that was a campaign and we'd gone outside, would I be watching everyone really carefully to see if they've got bitten at any stage? Oh, hell yes. And there would be no trust there. And that's also the thing. There is no trust in grimdark settings, really.
So it could be player versus player conflict as a part of it. Definitely.
Yeah, I think so. I think for grimdark, it's not the level of violence; it's the psychological terror to it as well. Violence is cheap in these games.
Yes, so as you say, there's potential for player versus player because of the sort of context in which you're playing, and we'll probably come on to mechanics a little bit in a second, because we're also talking about characters not necessarily getting better. So in old school Essentials or Dungeons and Dragons, you could argue that inevitably, if you survive and you get experience, you will become better over time. That there's, and you can obviously, you can play it in such a way your character starts to deteriorate. But other games like Red Markets or Call of Cthulhu is a classic, is that your character over time, they just get worse. They just degenerate. They are inevitably going to spiral down into some sort of either a moral or psychological or some sort of deterioration. And it doesn't matter how effective they might have been to start with, it's not going to end well. So it's like Fall of Delta Green or Delta Green is probably a good example of that.
A quick question, really. Is the difference between grim and grim dark? So when you're saying grim, is that the same as grim dark?
So I don't think it is, no.
So my experience, so my think about grimdark is often a game or term that gets used in conjunction with Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay and Warhammer 40k. It seems to come from there. So it's got that whole gothic style of things. Whereas, probably a grim game like Red Markets hasn't. It is well. So let's call it. Is grim a better term? What's different? God, no. Let's define our terms. So what's the difference between a grim game and a grimdark game?
On Discord just this morning, I actually put the GIF. I GIF searched grim dark, and the first thing that came up was Warhammer 40k. And obviously, this is a role playing term, so we should be really talking about heresy and everything else. The role playing versions of those. But that was the first thing that came up. It was Warhammer as a grim dark GIF, as a first 30 GIFs was Warhammer.
All Warhammer all the time.
So I'm also wondering, is it a European thing as well? Do we embrace more grimdark as a European thing in Britain and with Sweden with its free league rather than Americans?
So I don't know. So in my head, I'm thinking grimdark. Otherwise, spend a whole podcast talking about defining terms and stuff. But like grimdark, I say, is that whole 40k thing. I'd put Forbidden Lands in there because it's just so over the top horrible in terms of what's happening to you in that one, whereas something like Delta Green has got that level of seriousness to it. So maybe grimdark just means that it's just got a bit of a silly edge, whereas just a grim game, Red Markets, there is humor in there, but it's more about, oh, look what's happened to you, that's awful, hilarious. And again, in Delta Green, I'm sure that when you play that, it is funny, but you're just marveling at how horrible it's gone for people, rather than it being an outcome of the tone of the. It's almost like it's your response to the tone of the game, really. So let's agree. Let's call it grim gaming, because that's okay. And Graham won't beat us up when he needs next season. So call it that way.
So what's the difference between? No.
Have I answered your question?
No, you have. I just wasn't sure. I just thought it needs to be clear on. Yeah, I think grim makes more sense for sure. Absolutely.
You see, I'm playing devil's advocate. For me, a grim game is a game where odds are stacked heavily against you, but that there's a good chance you're going to pull through, you're going to succeed. There's that, that great big beacon there that you're heading towards. Grimdark for me says that beacon is a little match being held up that could be blown out at any stage, because chances are it's going to be. For me, that is the difference.
Little hope.
Yeah, I think with grim games there is hope, because if you can get through that grind fest or whatever you're facing, chances are you're going to get some reward, something at the end of it to say well done, even if it's short-lived.
I think if there's a chance you're going to survive, then and you expect to survive, then it's not grim, I would say.
Well,
so I think I suppose the difference between grim and grim dark is, what does dark mean in this? What makes it that much? It's not just grim; it's dark as well. I suppose that's it, isn't it?
Give me an example of a game that you think would be a game that would be grim, not.
Well, Alien is a good one, because we're all familiar with that setting. So you can, that you're a Marine or a roughneck or whatever, and you're doing your job, but then you're in a situation where things are getting steadily worse. But that's not necessarily dark in the same way. You're not reveling in the horribleness of it, I think, is the thing with Alien. It is a grim setting because life is tough.
It's more a consequence of it rather than the
aim of it.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, okay. That's interesting. I like that one. Not sure we'll ever come to a conclusion. I mean, there's probably generations of Reddits out there probably arguing about that term.
There are. I actually did have a brief, as I was trying to figure out myself, and I had a brief look down the rabbit hole, and as the abyss stared at me, I clicked off of it.
You said not together. Very wise. So let's talk a bit about mechanics then. So if we're going to say there's a game that's got a tone that is unforgiving, where death is commonplace, where your character is essentially it's going to go badly. Whatever happens, it's just how slowly you can delay the inevitable in that case. What strikes us in games of mechanics that model that well? I mean, the classic is Sanity, the mechanic really in Call of Cthulhu, I'd argue. I don't know if other games prior to that had got anything similar. I mean, I'm not didn't play a lot of those early games to sort of spot those things really.
I think Cthulhu's the first one, really. Seriously,
yeah, I'd agree with that. Yeah.
What's come up for me is I think it's Mothership and Alien. With the stress mechanics, and do you say that stress is a grim setting as well? Does that include? I did like the stress mechanics of Mothership and Alien.
Yeah, it's definitely, because when your characters are in that situation, I mean, the nice thing with Alien is a little bit of stress is giving you an edge, and you're feeling, yes, we're getting more successes, and then you reach a certain tipping point, and you're getting those bad things happening to you, and it gets into that cycle of getting worse and worse, and that's where you really feel hopeless, and so this is it, we're going to die,
and the whole party just loses it instantly.
Definitely. There's that cascading effect of one character panics and then everybody else around panics at the same time.
I'd argue that's probably a bit of a flaw in the system, to be honest.
Maybe.
Yeah. What about other games? So, I mean, because things I came up with, obviously Sanity and Call of Cthulhu. So Corruption in fantasy roleplay. I was Corruption. So I'm looking for Graham to nod at me here because he's still on mute. But was Corruption around in original fantasy roleplay, or was that a more recent?
Yeah.
I don't believe it was. I don't believe you had. I think you had insanity mechanics, but
okay.
I don't think you had corruption mechanics.
And now we've got you on. I want to hear about your objection to Grimdark. Now that we've sort of analysed it to death,
Grimdark games are played by edgelords. The two phrases kind of go hand in hand with me. I think people who say they play a lot, well, just from picking up the sort of general discourse online, I think people who say they play grimdark games, they play games where everything around them is dark and it's edgy and there's chaos, spiky bits, and there's a kind of dark tone. But I don't think they generally expect that bad things will happen to their characters.
Right, okay.
I think that's grimdark for me. That's just a personal take. I would put that. Whereas I would just prefer the term grim or depressing. I'll play, I will play games to be fun, but some games have got more darker background than others. I think you were asking about some mechanics examples. I would add Call of Cthulhu is a bow down and worship Call of Cthulhu because that gave us the death spiral of Sanity. I'd mentioned Delta Green, big fan of Delta Green. They've got the additional depressing edge of bonds. So briefly, you can use bonds as sanity armor. You can put a bond in play to deflect some of your sanity loss. And by putting that bond in play, it says you are losing a human relationship with someone close to you. So you put your bonds out there to begin with. You say, I've got a bond with my wife, I've got my kid, or you could just say family, have the two of them as one bond. You could have a bond with your brother, and maybe you could have your bowling club as your third bond. And as you use them to deflect sanity loss, so you can't deflect all sanity loss, but some sanity loss away from your character as you do the core, the core function of the game, which is to confront the mythos, investigate mysteries. Your bonds will deteriorate, and you're asked to give examples, just brief examples at the beginning of each, maybe each scenario. Show me how that bond has deteriorated, And
so
obviously,
it goes beyond your character, then, doesn't it? Really, so it sort of becomes more narrative rather than just a mechanical.
It's not hugely narrative. It's like 5 minutes at the start of each scenario.
Yeah.
You visit each character in their personal life, and you say, "Okay, that bond went down a wee bit because of that last adventure. Show me how this has affected your relationship with that character, that NPC." And as the game goes on, if you're assuming your character survives the horrible things they're investigating, they're going to lose touch with it, and all the characters become living in garages with pictures pinned to the wall. And
just come back to Red Markets, which that mechanize that as well. So with it's your family, so it's your people, your contact. So you need those contacts to be able to maintain your humanity, and you can lose them by not spending money on them. So it's that whole stress thing can go on.
Just on Red Markets, because I played that game with you at Grogmeet, that's even more hostile, because if I understand right, NPCs or anything you encounter, like casualties in the game, if they're attacking you, it's assumed it's an auto success, and you've got to sort of buy back their success. That's the way I understood the rules.
Market always wins. That's right.
It's market. So that's fairly grim. That's a fairly grim assumption to put in a game, and really novel and interesting.
It's a great game to run. I love it. Okay, what about other mechanics that sort of come out in terms of deterioration?
I've got a game. I'm gonna show you. It's
okay.
It's the Idiot's Guide to How to Build a Hole. Yeah, no, it is. It's best left buried, and so I've not read it for a while, but it has this concept of grip, and it's not just like your mental health. It does cover stamina as well. But what happens in the game is you can spend it to kind of get yourself out of holes, or it can be like sanity rolls in Cthulhu. You encounter horrendous things, and you have to make grip tests, and so when your grip gets to 0, basically that you're out of the game. You're not necessarily dead, but you go and join the other side, or you run off and live in a hole under the mountains somewhere with a ring or something like that. But you get these afflictions on the way, and these afflictions all have negative consequences on your character. So the whole game, right from the moment you start playing it, you know that your characters have only got so long, and they're going to go on this like spiral, this descent, getting weaker and more afflicted and more disturbed. I think it's a really interesting idea, and be kind of like Muckborg, because it's relatively easy to create a new character. You can live with that, and I think that makes it really interesting. And then there's this. It does talk about well, you might say, well, I'm not going to try and spend grip, but again, it's if you don't spend grip, then you're going to equally end up in a mess. So you got to find the balance between spending grip, but you never get it back. Once it's gone, it's gone. So it's like
it's that trajectory, isn't it? Really?
Yeah. I think it's really interesting.
But it'd be possible to have a game which is grim, where actually physical damage, physical threat isn't the issue. Maybe, actually, it's more about it's going to be about that psychological deterioration, which is you could have that, and that would, for me, that would be quite a grim game.
Yeah,
or actually psychological consequences of being injured rather than anything else.
The other system I was going to say as well, pre-pandemic, I played the One Ring first edition, and we played a whole campaign. And one of our dwarfs, his shadow points, and that's that system of accumulating shadow points, the temptation of gold and treasure, and all that. So the accumulation of shadow points to the point that, near enough that the end of our campaign near the Grey Mountains, he accumulated all those shadow points, and he was like, he turned around to all of us and he said, "That's it, guys. I've accumulated too many shadow points." He just walks off into the distance, and we literally had a couple of players were in tears, just saying, "Oh my God, Dave's dwarf's just walked off into the distance. He's going to be eaten by trolls." And we said, "Yeah, but we can't do anything about it. He's just so." And I absolutely loved, the One Ring for actually, putting that game mechanics.
So I would argue that's tragedy.
Yeah, it is. It's very grim.
Different thing, because I think if you're looking at, like I say, for me, in a Delta Green, there is no heroism, there is no pathos. It's essentially, it's just horrible things. Whereas in the One Ring, it's that inevitable struggle against the shadow, which I suppose it depends how you run these things or play these things, isn't it? So I'm thinking about Vampire Cat actually.
Vampire, for me, you've got the struggle with your humanity. 5th edition, as I've been playing it for a couple of years now, but I'm still sort of feeling my way with that. But as I say, it's remarkably easy to lose humanity. It's not easy to drag your humanity back up. And it affects everything on your social interactions. If your humanity drops enough, humans are just generally a bit weirded by you. You are the weirdo in the Mac, basically. Right through to, animals will actually try and attack you. Whereas the higher you are, the more human you are. Oddly enough, World of Darkness has always put humans as humanity 7. Not 10, you're 7. So, you can actually drag your humanity up higher than the humans. But it's that loss, and it's the fact that you're not always going to win. No matter how well your character does at trying to cling on, you know that you're heading one way. And that is quite grim, particularly when you're struggling and you try and make a good action, but it doesn't kind of work.
I think in 5th edition, Ken Hite made a particular point that because he doesn't like vampires. So when you wrote Knights Black Agents, it's about, actually, I hate vampires. I want, the people to beat. Yeah. I want to be players to be the ones that beat up vampires. But then, obviously, ironically, then got contracted to do 5th edition. I think he built in that whole thing about humanity and the mechanics to sort of that. It's really hard to be feeding on your fellow humans and to maintain your humanity.
Actually, I'd argue he's actually made Vampire far more dark and grim than the original versions, because you no longer have blood pool as a resource. It can run out really quickly now, or you can stay really high for ages. You can't feed to keep it up, if that makes sense, whereas you could in the earlier editions. And also, a few other things that he's kind of done with it. Makes it a lot darker. It's a lot harder to hide what you are.
You're not superheroes, are you, like you were before?
You're definitely not a superhero with a katana anymore.
Well, I'd say, that's one of the things that put me off Vampire in the earlier editions, was that it just seemed to be too much fun to be this blood-sucking evil creature. And that approach that Kat was talking about is much, much better as a game, because you're confronted by what you are, and you're doing these horrible things, and if you're playing the game and role playing into that, that's giving you that experience to explore that moral horror in a controlled way. And I think that's, I think maybe moving on to why we enjoy these things. That's definitely one of the things for me, is it's putting you in these situations and you getting you to experience emotions that you wouldn't necessarily get in other games, by putting you in that situation. So I think that's definitely sounds like an interesting mechanic for that.
So let's think about moving on to why we like grim games and favourite grim games. But just to round up then, so we were saying that tone and background is really important, that you need to have that sense of actually, the world, whatever the world is, whether it be Dark Sun or the world of Lamentations, it's not a great place. No one's having a good time really in that situation, and actually the player characters aren't that much different to everybody else. That there's element of lethality is good, but it's not required to make a game grim. It's more about the psychological outcome for the characters. And it's that sort of sense that it's going to go badly for you. It's just at what point and who else you drag down with you, and having that sort of built into games. And I think mechanisms that support that are what we like in games. So why do you like grim games? Well, do you like grim games?
Oh yeah, I definitely do. Yeah, I definitely do. I think it's like the same reason I like old school, OSE, that kind of thing. I do like games where you are a bit more heroic as well. But I think with grim games, I think there's I think the settings are really appealing, and you get lots of interest in like moral dilemmas and stuff like that. I think the characters generally are far less powerful, almost ordinary people in many cases, or a little bit better. Death could be lurking around any corner. You've got to be very cautious. I just find it much more interesting, to be honest. I do like a good scrap as much as anybody in my games, not in real life, of course. But I think it's really rewarding to kind of deal with an encounter without, going in guns blazing, swords flashing, and whatever, and actually doing that, because that if you do go charging in, there's a good chance you're going to get that's handed to you.
And even if you do win the fight, then there'll be other consequences which aren't as good. So again, it's the dice are loaded against you, really.
Yeah, absolutely.
So is that your grim game recommendation then, or have you got another one that you'd sort of you put out there?
Yeah, I mean, I think my recommendation would be Lamentations of the Flame Princess. I think the system aside, I mean, it's a great implementation of Bacme. It's really, really nicely done, and I think as a system, it works really well. But it's much more about the adventures and the settings and the tools that go with it. And the artwork, there's a lot of kind of really disturbing artwork and ideas as well.
Yeah. I think things like Better Than Any Man. So that's the 30 Years War one, isn't it?
Better Than, Death, Frost, Doom is another one where, basically, if you screw it up, you signal the end of the world kind of thing. There's a lot of that kind of stuff.
So the stakes are high.
Yeah.
Either individually or but for the world as well. So that's another aspect of a grim game that it needs to have literally life or death for everybody involved in the game world, hopefully.
Yes. I hope so.
I like grim games because, well, as you said, the worlds are always more interesting for these games. I'm going to be honest. They have better lore involved. I always just feel they're much more together. But I like playing them or running them. It's just the fact it steps me out of my comfort zone, but in a safe way. So I can explore what it would be like to be in an absolutely post-apocalyptic world, hunting down zombies or trying to get resources, or I can be a vampire trying to struggle against night to maintain that sliver of humanity to keep on going a bit longer and not walk into the sun. They're all things I'll never get to do in,
You hope.
I hope. I mean, I know the Tory party are trying their hardest. Let's hope grid markets doesn't exist. But it's that fact you can put yourself into somebody else's shoes, and also you don't have to make the best decision for them. You can make it worse for your character just to see what's going to happen. And I like being able to do that sometimes in some games. I don't always do it, but it's nice. I like that struggle. And it's always so much more rewarding, even if you get just that small little chink of light, and it just makes it much more of a fun game for me. My recommendation probably would be Vampire or Cymberan, to be honest, if you want a more fantasy setting.
It's interesting because, again, it comes back to that point about it's about moral, red markets. So that's the game I'm obviously going to put forward. But in that, there was in the campaign game, there was a moral quandary at the end, and I think it's interesting when you get players and they go, what would I do in that situation? Thinking, well, what would their characters do? What would they do? And it's not I will definitely do it this way. It's more about those shades of grey that I think to make it interesting, which you do get absolutely in Vampire and other games as well.
Right. So definitely for me, I mean, I'm a bit of a Free League fanboy. I think we've already mentioned Vaesen and Alien, but the one I'd pick is Things from the Flood, which is the sequel game to Tales from the Loop. It takes that optimistic place where there's this fabulous technology and mysteries and kids running around on their bikes, and they're always going to get home safely and have lashings of ginger beer. And it turns that on its head, that you're now these teenagers. The town is in ruins. There's a flood, and the main business there has failed. So there's unemployment and crime. And instead of having something they're proud of, the teenage characters have a secret shame that will probably come out in play, and they'll be revealed to their friends as this thing that they're ashamed of, and they'll have to confront it. And they can die, but they probably won't. There are worse things that can happen. They can end up emotionally broken, and they'll leave town under this cloud of shame or whatever's happened to them in the course of the adventure. So definitely if you lean into that, it's that angst and the setting and the rules as well that make that definitely a grim game if you want to play it like that.
Yeah, that's pretty dark. I mean, that's one I've got on my shelf. I've never actually looked at it in any great detail, but the way you've described it there, God, it sounds depressing. So, but yeah, no, I get you. And I think building that in obviously is core to the characters in terms of what that outcome's going to be. Much more they might struggle against it.
It's the horror movies. I love actually watching horror movies, and my favorite film of all time is Alien. So that's where it kind of is the basis. And the thing is, as well, is this you get these people get players who've been playing years and years of D&D 5e, especially nowadays. And my first recommendation straight away is like, you've been playing superheroes in a fantasy world, and my recommendation is Call of Cthulhu. It's like you're playing the planet Earth, America and Europe, and everybody goes, oh yeah, I know that. And you're playing actual fragile characters, 1920s fragile characters that could faint at a sight of a zombie. And they're like, oh my God, does that actually happen? I'm like, there's rules, mechanics for the sanity. So my love, Call of Cthulhu, which goes hand in hand with Delta Green, and I absolutely love Delta Green. And I can't recommend the starter set for Delta Green, which is Need to Know, and the little adventure which I ran at a con, which is absolutely fantastic, which is Last Things Last, with that moral dilemma at the very end. The players are going, oh my God, what am I going to do? Yeah, what am I going to do? But I'm not going to say what the moral dilemma is, but it's an absolute superb little con game. So Call of Cthulhu and Delta Green for me.
I suspect that might have jumped all over what Graham was going to say then, actually. So, Graham, grim games. Why do you like them? And what's your pick? You can pick Delta Green if you want. That's fine.
I think why I like grim games. I mean, I love all role playing games. I love all flavors of them. I think maybe grim games are slightly more adult. They're like the HBO box set version of games compared to your mainstream telly of games. Without, like I say, I've got sometimes I just want to lie back and watch mainstream telly. But if you're appealing to my more slightly more artistic sense, then there's slightly more drama, there's slightly more heightened realism as far as role playing games go. Within grim games, the stakes seem a bit more serious. And that just adds a salt to it and gives an extra flavour. So that's how I'd express it. But yeah, I mean, Fabio's pissed all over my chips there with
sorry, Graham.
With Call of Cthulhu and Delta Green. But I would probably fine tune it to Delta Green. I have witnessed examples of and heard on podcast examples of Call of Cthulhu where it's kind of like PG Wodehouse plus tentacles. Some people play it that way. Not fun. Slightly not for me. I'd like it. I like it a bit more serious than that. And I think Delta Green kind of restricts that possibility, gives it a sort of tighter focus. I think that was true when it was a supplement for Call of Cthulhu, and it's even more true now. It's its own thing. It's its own rule set, and it's added things like the bonds I was mentioning earlier on. They give that even more focus. So yeah, summing up Call of Cthulhu and Delta Green. Probably Red Markets as well. I need to know more about Red Markets and experience it more. But you talk about the core activity of players in a game. That's where the characters get punished for engaging in the core activity. And I think as players, you're either up for that or not.
Yeah.
So I think some players butt against that, and that's because they want to do something more heroic. That's fine. And there's another type of player who says, yeah, tell me more about that, and they buy into it. And you get Call of Cthulhu veterans who love telling stories about how their characters died in really grim and horrible ways. And the nastier their character death, the better it is. And I think you're either one or the other, possibly.
Yeah, I look a bit of both. I mean, heroism's great. I mean, there's nothing better than flying around in a cape and with your fists of steel and laying down some punishment on some evil people. But but equally, I think games where you're just really struggling. I think really long-term play, I think that'd be quite hard. I think it's can be quite an intense experience. So I think it is, can be more focused. But no, I'm with you. I think all the games we've sort of talked about, I've got a lot of time for. Things from the Flood is a new one for me, although I've got it, I've never actually taken it off the shelf. So we'll have to have a look at that one. But I think we've pretty much reached the end of it in that case. Are there any other thoughts? Anything you want to throw in there? I'm sure we'll have lots of people arguing about Grimdark versus Grim, but I think you captured it there, Graham, with that one. So thanks everybody for taking the time. Take it easy. Speak to you soon.
Thank you.
Speak soon.
Bye.
Cheers,
Bye-bye.
bye.
Bye.
Hi, Steve. Just some additional thoughts to hopefully help you pad out the Grim episode of your podcast. First point is background. Is this sufficient to make a game grim? I think that's pretty clear that it's probably not just enough. I think for grim games, what we're talking about is a combination of a grim setting or a grim premise for the game. Most horror games would probably fit that category, but I think you need to have mechanics to back the grimness up. I mean, I can imagine, for example, perhaps there's probably D&D settings which are considered quite dark, maybe similar to something like Warhammer or something like that. But I mean, the mechanics of D&D for characters is generally one of progression and getting better. I think you've got to look at games, classic examples being like Call of Cthulhu, Delta Green, where you've got a grim premise, you're encountering horrors and cosmic horrors, and in addition you've got mechanics which back up. The death spiral of Society and Cthulhu being an example. Essentially, the more you play the game, the worse it's going to be for your character, and likewise for Delta Green, and that's further enhanced by mechanics around combat, which are pretty realistic and quite lethal. So I think for a game to be truly grim, you probably need that kind of combination. Just on the subject of Warhammer, I think we touched upon this when we talked about Warhammer in one of your other episodes. On the face of it, it's a reasonably, grim setting. There's disease, there's corruption, political, and more fundamentally from the forces of chaos. You've got chaos gods and demons intruding. I think the thing that offsets Warhammer for being a truly grim game for me is there's two things really. There's aforementioned the humour, which I myself and others talked about with regards to Warhammer. That kind of lightens the mood somewhat. That sort of thread of dark humour through Warhammer. Okay, it is black humour or sarcastic humour sometimes, but it is there. And secondly, although there are mechanics in Warhammer which tend towards grimness, the risk from corruption from chaos, as I said, or possibly going insane, or maybe catching, a nasty disease. There are mechanics in Warhammer which kind of offset that again. So obviously there's the various meta currencies is the word. Yeah, so you've got your meta currencies. There's 4 types of those in Warhammer, so a player can sort of expend those to kind of offset some of the really bad outcomes they're coming from. And chief one being, which has been there from first edition, is the fate point. So that marks your character as a wee bit more, he's slightly above the common herd in that respect, because he can expend these fate points, mitigate against death. And if you're mitigating against death, that game means the game, tends towards grimness, but isn't truly grim, in my opinion. Fragility of characters is an interesting one. Perhaps Kath has maybe got something to say about Vampire, which she's got more knowledge of than I have. To my knowledge, the vampire characters in Vampire the Masquerade or whatever incarnation that's going through now, I don't know how fragile those characters are compared to each other. Certainly they're probably less fragile than the human beings they prey upon. So that's an interesting one. That to me strikes of a game which has got quite a dark premise, provided it's played in that manner and not just as kind of vampire superheroes with katanas and trench coats and that kind of thing. It does have a dark premise because you are a predator amongst human society, and as an ex-human, I suppose that's got to do things to you. But yeah, your character might not be that fragile. It takes something to take your character down. I don't know. I don't have much experience of being a vampire, but to my mind, a character being fragile and susceptible to the true rigours of nasty violence in combat. To me, that's what it would be an essential again for a grim game. But willing to be persuaded otherwise if Vampire in other respects fits the criteria for a grim game. It's just that the characters aren't as fragile as normal humans. Then maybe that's an exception. Trying to think of other mechanisms that underpin grimness in some games or settings. I think we've touched on Delta Green. Maybe worth emphasising again, I think that the bond mechanic in Delta Green's particularly interesting, and that's how you end up with characters like Rust Cole, Matthew McConaughey's character in True Detective Season 1, who towards the end he's basically alone in a garage with a conspiracy board of pins and string and photographs and evidence around him and no one else. And that's how you get to those kind of characters. I think that's one of the best illustrations of this. Examples of grim happenings in games. I always come back to Call of Cthulhu and or Delta Green. But I've run quite a grim scenario. I think I've run it 2 or 3 times now, which is originally Call of Cthulhu scenario. But I've run it in a sort of Delta Green setting. It's a scenario called Love's Lonely Children. I mean, the basic premise is quite grim. It involves a murdered prostitute. Her parents are, essentially pornographers. They run this really sort of sleazy sort of pornographic emporium, if you like. And anyway, I've run that scenario I think 2 or 3 times, and at least twice the PCs have ended up being sent to a hospital to sort of execute a bedridden patient, and terrorising the poor innocent hospital staff as they do so, all in the name of the so-called greater good. So, both times I've run that, and the players have sort of been looking at themselves and wondering what exactly they're doing. But I mean, that's the kind of thing that where Delta Green excels, that you get these sort of really grey, if not downright black, moral choices to make, all in the name of fighting for the greater good for humanity. And why do we enjoy that? I don't know. Maybe we're all slightly twisted and sick, but I think having to make choices like that just adds a bit more drama and a wee bit more, dare I say, realism to our lovely wee sort of fictional games. Oh, anyway, Steve, I think that's for me. Hopefully this is some useful material you can fit in, and hopefully chat soon. Bye.
Thanks for listening to another exploration of my gaming vexes. If you've got any thoughts you'd like to add to what you've heard here, or a gaming vex of your own you'd like to offer up for discussion, you can contact me on Twitter @AllAnthar, or you can leave a voice message. The link's on the podcast webpage on Anchor, or can be found in the show notes. Until the next time, may all your games be free of vexatiousness, and be excellent to each other, always.